morning, everyone, and welcome to the Institute for Policy Integrity's annual conference. I'm Don Goodson, Policy Integrity's Executive Director. For those of you unfamiliar with policy integrity, we are a nonpartisan think tank dedicated to using economics and law to promote smart government decision-making, especially in the area of climate and energy policy. We employ roughly 30 staff members, comprised mostly of lawyers and PhD economists, who produce original research and advocate for reforms before courts and agencies primarily. Our theme for our annual conference this year is Clean Energy in a Time of Shifting Federal Policy. Now, I'm sure many in this room may be scratching their heads a little bit at that title, thinking that calling the events of recent months a shift in federal policy is a bit of an understatement. With that, let's maybe broadly recap where we are and what has happened over the past few months. The new administration came to power and has used new tools, old tools, and controversial tools to slow the build-out of renewables and promote fossil fuels. At the same time, however, the amount of new energy being added to the U.S. this year is projected to reach a record-breaking 64 gigawatts, according to the Energy Information Administration, and notably, the bulk of it will be clean energy. At the same time, electricity demand also continues to grow, thanks to data centers and the continued electrification of the economy. Then, of course, there's the aggressive deregulation that we have seen. The new administration's deregulatory actions are seeking to undo all of the vast majority of the previous administration's accomplishments, which of course is nothing new or surprising, but the speed and mechanics of it are. And those actions will almost certainly be challenged in court to the extent that they haven't been already. I could go on. Luckily, however, we have an outstanding line of experts joining us today to unpack the past 9 months and look ahead at what's coming down the road. Now, a few logistics before we get going. Starting with questions for our panelists, please jot them down on the note cards that you see at your table, and one of our staff members floating around the room will collect them and hand them up to the moderators, who will try to get to the questions over the course of each discussion. For the lawyers seeking CLE credits, those joining in the room, please be sure to sign in and out at the registration table outside to make sure that you get your CLE credits. For those of us joining online, our moderators will read out a conspicuous code once during each discussion, and you'll need to make note of that code to get your CLE credit online. Lunch will be just after our fireside chat. We'll also have a coffee break at 2 and a short reception at 3:30 from 3:30 to 4 for those of you able to stick around. If you need anything in between, check in with our staff at the registration desk outside and they'll be able to help you. I also want to encourage folks, if you want to learn more about policy integrity, and I hope you do, please sign up for our newsletters, which using the QR codes on the back of your brochures. You can also go to policyintegrity.org/newsletter. You can also support us at policyintegrity.org/donate. Our efforts to champion smart government decision-making cannot be done without the generous support of individuals and foundations, so I do encourage folks to go there. And on that note, I want to send a thanks to all of our supporters for joining us in the room and online today. I also want to give a special thank you to our moderators and to David Turk and Kathleen Baron for joining us for our fireside chat, and to all of our panelists for being with us today, especially those who traveled far and wide to be here. I also want to thank the Policy Integrity staff for helping to pull this event together, especially Natalie Shartove, Alyssa Schiff, Matt Fleck, and Derek Sylvan. And I want to just pause for a moment. I know many people have been bouncing around New York City this week for UN Climate Week, and I have found it genuinely inspiring to see everyone this week and in this room and be reminded that the climate and energy field is full of committed, caring, and innovative people who just keep moving forward even in the face of pretty stiff headwinds. Now I'd like to introduce Ricky Revesz. Ricky co-founded Policy Integrity in 2008 and now serves as our faculty director. He's also the Ann Bryce Professor of Law and Dean Emeritus here at the law school. He rejoined our team in January this year after serving as the administrator of the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, or OIRA, in the White House Office of Management and Budget. And we've been so glad to have him back and benefit from his deep expertise and many years of experience. Now with that, I will hand it over to Ricky, who will introduce our fireside chat.
2 minutes. Thank you so much, Don. I think it makes sense for the Fireside chatters to come up to sit in these chairs here. Thank you so much, Don. It's really an enormous pleasure to be back here. For the last 2 years, I couldn't come to these conferences, which are among my favorite events of the year, because I was in the government and couldn't do things like this. And it's wonderful to come back and see policy integrity thriving under Don's leadership. When Mike Livermore, who's here, and I started policy integrity in 2008, there were 5 full-time employees, and the space that was allotted to us was literally a closet. And when we had to have for meetings, someone had to get up so that someone could close the door. It's not that we have palatial space now, but we have adequate space for our team. And we've gone from 5 people to 28 people, PhD economists and lawyers. And in my 2 years in the federal government, where I was responsible for overseeing the process of promulgating executive branch regulations, I got to see firsthand some of policy integrity's the influence policy integrity had on a number of analytical issues and how that affected, in a positive way, the work of the government. It's also nice for me to return and see what this institution can look like when it's well managed, very well managed. Don has been an extraordinary leader, and it makes me see all the failings I had when I was doing some of the things that Don does now. But it's been wonderful for me to reconnect with a lot of our substantive work, especially on work related to federal regulations. So now I get to introduce our panelists, including. So let me start just. I'll do this in order for. So Avi Zevin. Avi Zevin and I started working together in 2010, I believe, when he was a second-year student taking my environmental law class. By the way, he is not the only student who took the class that semester who's actually on the panel in this conference, or who I worked with closely in the government. And that was like an enormous, enormous privilege. So Avi graduated from NYU Law School. He eventually came back to policy integrity and was our clean energy FERC senior attorney, and contributed a great deal to us launching a real kind of FERC presence. And then Avi went into the federal government, and he was Principal Deputy General Counsel and Deputy General Counsel for Energy Policy at the U.S. Department of Energy, and then came over to the White House complex, where he was Special Assistant to the President for Clean Energy Implementation. And in both these government contexts, Avi and I got to work closely together, which was really fun. I have to tell you that one of the weirdest things that happened to me in government is my first week, maybe second week, the Secretary of Energy hosted a very nice lunch for me, and Dave Turk was there, and the General Counsel was there, and we were talking, and then someone, I think it might have been the General Counsel, Sam Walsh, said, you sound a lot like Avi. And I said, well, Avi was my student. Maybe, do you think that maybe Avi sounds like me? and I realized that what I had said was, connects to policy integrity's work. I had referred to hand-wavy analysis, which apparently was something that Avi might have said at some point in some high-level Department of Energy meeting as well. So thank you, Avi, for being here, for having been a friend and a colleague for so many years, and for agreeing to moderate this panel. Kathleen Barron is Executive Vice President and Chief Strategy and Growth Officer of Constellation Energy. And Constellation is the nation's largest producer of carbon-free energy and the leading competitive retail supplier of energy products and services for 2 million homes and businesses across the United States. She's had a storied career. She had previously served as Executive Vice President for Government Regulatory Affairs and Public Policy, and had also, for Constellation and its predecessor, the Exelon Corporation. Kathleen also had a distinguished career in government, where she served as Deputy General Counsel at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. So thank you, Kathleen. Welcome to Policy Integrity. and I'm delighted that you're on the panel. And Dave Turk was, there was no deputy secretary I admired more than Dave Turk. I worked very closely with deputy secretaries on regulatory matters. Basically, they called me when they didn't like what we were doing, and I tried to be nice. And Dave was a wonderful, wonderful colleague. Also, a big consumer of our services because the Energy Department had, a lot of appliance efficiency standards. I mean, one of the things I learned in government is how many appliances there are. Because in order to have an appliance efficiency standard, you need an appliance. And I didn't know that there were so many appliances, much less that they needed efficiency standards, but it turned out to be the case. So Dave is an extraordinarily public servant. He served as the #2 official and chief operating officer of the Department of Energy. And when you think about the scale of government agencies, it's easy to think, cabinet agencies are all roughly the same size. So, I worked at OMB. I had a fairly small staff, but my boss, Shalanda Young, the OMB director, had, about 550 people who worked at OMB. I asked the Secretary of Energy at that meeting, because we were talking about staff, and I said, well, how many people work at the Department of Energy? He said, well, if you count the national labs, it's roughly 100,000. I made a pitch to her, which was not, she did not accept, which was, because part of the problem is, we were reviewing all these regulations. We had a staff of 50 people, and it was, it took some time to do. So I said, look, if you gave us 0.1% of your staff, no one notices, 0.1% of 1%. That's 100 people. We would practically triple our size, and we could actually do this stuff much more quickly. You have a lot of people who have a lot of regulatory knowledge in your department. I thought this was a great deal. We didn't get the 100 people, but it let me understand the scope of the operation that Dave ran. I mean, the budget of the Energy Department is roughly $50 billion per year. This is running a staggeringly enormous operation, and Dave ran it extraordinarily well and had a reputation across government as having run it so well. Before that, Dave served as Deputy Executive Director of the International Energy Agency, where he focused on helping countries around the world make progress towards clean energy transitions. He had also worked in various high-ranking positions in the Obama administration across a whole range of agencies and offices of the executives of the president. So it gives me enormous pleasure to welcome back two friends, and you always have to meet new people, and now next time it'll be three friends. Now that I've met Kathleen, and I leave things in Avi's very capable hands to moderate this fireside chat, which will not have any fire because that would not be consistent with the theme of this conference. Thank you.
Thank you, Ricky. That was very generous of you, and it has been a pleasure to work with you and to sound like you for the last little bit now. Ricky's generosity is sort of very well known. When he recruited me to come to Policy Integrity to come back after I was a student, I told him I was living in Washington, D.C., and I have a family, and we're not going to move to New York. And this was pre-pandemic, when there was more sort of expectation about moving into New York and living where you work. And he said, it's fine. You can just stay in my guest room a couple nights a week. And I did that for a while. And I don't think that offer is open to everyone else, because Ricky has since moved. But just Ricky's generosity is truly legendary, and he's been a mentor for a long time. So thank you for everything you've done, and thank you to the Policy Integrity team for having me back and having me here, and for doing all the incredible work you're doing. And thank you to Kathleen and to to Dave. I'm going to call you Dave, but it's a little awkward because I'm used to calling him Deputy Secretary from when he was my boss, for being here. And I'm glad to have this conversation. I hope that you guys are doing most of the talking, and I'm just here to make sure we're sort of moving in roughly the right direction. So rather than spending a lot more time at the front end, why don't we just jump right into it? I will awkwardly give the CLE code sort of halfway through the panel. So that's, if I say some random word, it's, you can all expect that. But okay, so why don't we just jump in? There's a lot going on in the energy sector right now. It's a time of change. It's a time of focus. It's, we've seen more public focus on the energy sector, I think, recently than we have in some time. So I thought maybe we just sort of start with a very general question and have each of you talk a little bit about the trends that you're seeing. What are the most important things that are actually happening in the sector? And, what can we distinguish sort of fads or sort of political attention versus like what's actually happening in the sector that we should be paying attention to as we're trying to move forward? So Kathleen, you're first here on my left, so why don't you start?
Great, thanks, Avi, and good morning, everyone. It is great to be here. I am a recovering lawyer, but more to the point, I have 2 kids in undergrad and 1 in law school, so I am used to debating and losing conversations with young people. So I hope we do get to questions from the audience, because that's always the most fun part of sort of hearing what's on people's minds and making sure that we're addressing it. But we are jumping right in. So I do think a little bit of background, though, that may inform some of the things I say. Constellation is a power generator and marketer. We are not a utility company. That means we don't own the poles and wires that go to your house. We just make that commodity that keeps the lights on and powers the economy. And we operate in competitive markets. So that means we do not have a guaranteed rate base or customer base that compensates us for what we do. We get a market price for power, whatever that market price is. We have to live with it. It might mean some of our machines run. It might mean some of our machines don't. But we do own power generation. As Avi said, that's 90% carbon-free, and that's because we own hydro, wind, solar, and 25 nuclear reactors around the U.S. But we also have CCGTs, or gas plants that run all the time, as well as a bunch of gas peakers that come on just when we're in times of very high demand. And so starting with the trends, of course, are demand is going up. That is not just because of the data economy and data centers and the tech industry. It's also because the economy is growing in terms of electrification of different types of economic growth, transportation, some in the industrial sector, some in the building sector. But the logical scapegoat around town is, from this demand growth perspective, is people saying it's all the tech industry and data centers. And there's some higher utilization of data centers going on as we are all using the technology that we rely on. I see some people looking at their phones right now, so I know it's in use. But there is, I think, more of a focus on what's next and what does that demand growth look like at a time when we are letting go of more base load, fossil fuel-fired power plants, coal plants retiring, some gas plants retiring, some of that because of economics, but some of that because we have some state laws in places that require it. So how are we going to meet growing demand? How are we going to meet the needs of this new growing sector in the data economy that in a lot of respects, and Dave will probably speak to this, is not just an economic growth, an economic development opportunity, but also a national security issue for the United States. And what tools are we going to use to make sure that we don't have a reliability problem? That has to be the first thing. It's Climate Week, and we are, a very heavily climate-focused company, but we all know if people have to pick between, brown power and no power, they're going to pick the brown power. So we have to keep the lights on. That's going to challenge our climate goals if we have a reliability problem. In terms of other trends, I do think there is a renewed emphasis on new types of clean firm generation. We have done a very good job, and at the outset, we talked about the amount of new megawatts coming onto the system. They're predominantly wind and solar, and that's because we've had very robust wind and solar support programs at the federal level, at the state level, and among corporate buyers who are willing to finance new development, and that's great. We need to see more of that. We need to see more of storage-type resources, but we also need to have clean resources that are dispatchable. So by that, I'm talking about nuclear, I'm talking about geothermal, and carbon capture and sequestration. So I am seeing more focus on those types of technologies and on ways to finance them, get them on the grid, that's a trend I hope continues. But there's a lot more I could say, but I'll stop there and let Dave go.
Great, thanks.
Well, let me first thank you, Avi, for chairing this, and I want to thank Ricky too, and Kathleen actually. And if I could make a broader point on public service, I'm sure Ricky's life was pretty good before he joined us in the U.S. government. And then he took on an incredibly important role. It's not a role that many people know, but it's an incredibly important role where he did get a lot of complaints from us, Avi, at the Department of Energy and other departments, but he handled it so well. And Avi, I want to thank you for your public service too. Kathleen, if I'm right about your bio, I think you served in the FERC back in the day, which is an incredibly important agency that not that many people know about. And I just wanted to put a plug. I know federal service right now is being challenged in all sorts of ways. Public service is being challenged, but encourage folks to think about it at some point in their career. It's incredibly rewarding, getting to work with the likes of Avi on a daily basis, the quality of person, the passion that's there. There's so much good that the U.S. federal government can do. And just encourage you at some point, maybe not right now, but at some point in the future to think about federal service. All right, so that's my public service announcement. All right, key trends. So let me focus on three. And first one, Kathleen mentioned, and just a little color and texture on that. For about 15 years or so, we've had flat electricity demand in our country for a number of reasons. And as Kathleen said, one of the most notable things is we're having an increase in demand, quite a notable increase in demand. And how does the system respond to that is a really, really big deal, not just for climate change, but for economic opportunities, for competitiveness internationally. Data centers get all the attention, but I think the best estimates I've seen is with a lot of uncertainty, it's about 50% of that demand is data centers. So it's not all data centers, although they are chunky, they are big, they are challenging to bring onto the grid for a number of reasons. But there's a lot of other reasons for that increase in electricity demand. So that's point one. Point two. From the technology perspective, and especially the cost perspective, it is incredible what's happened, not just here in the U.S., but internationally. Solar gets a lot of the attention. Solar should get a lot of the attention. The cost of solar in the U.S., the cost of solar internationally has just plummeted. It's just amazing to see that kind of cost reduction all around the world. It's not only to the point where most of the electrons right now in the U.S. are solar. By far, the overwhelming majority of new electrons brought onto our grid is solar because it's cheap. But it's happening all around the world, and what's particularly exciting, as someone, as Ricky mentioned, I've done a lot of work working with emerging economies around the world. We're starting to see huge solar pickup in Pakistan. We're starting to see huge solar pickup finally in Africa. If you're not familiar with those trends and you need some good news, go just do some Google searches and let AI point you in terms of what progress we're seeing around the world on that front. But it's not just solar, it's also battery storage, which is incredibly exciting because, of course, solar power only powers when the sun's on. I was testifying at a hearing, just as a side note, and I had a few Republican members. This was on AI data centers and how we power AI data centers. And a few Republican members who were trying to score political points, I guess, made the observation that solar power only works when the sun is shining. I think we knew that. I think we knew that.
Yeah, if you look at polling, though, there's a lot of Americans who don't believe that. They actually think it works 24/7. So,
All right. So maybe there was a valid point being made there. My point is, at least those who follow energy knew that, and so that's why we have to have grids. That's why we have to have battery storage. That's why we have to have a range of solutions to try to be cost-effective, to try to be resilient, to try to make sure that we've got that reliability that U.S. consumers around the country demand. The other technologies that maybe don't get as much attention, and they're sort of baskets of technologies, virtual power plants is something that's incredibly interesting, powerful. All that means is we have a variety, demand during the day shifts over time, right? Sometimes we use more electricity, sometimes we use less electricity. As Kathleen certainly knows, we need to have enough generation to deal with those peaks, right? Whether it's the summer heat or when people are using a lot of energy. Virtual power plants just means, can you as a demand, as a user of electricity, shave off that peak? Can you use a little bit of electricity when the prices are really high? Virtual power plants means you conglomerate, you aggregate that across a variety of users. Incredibly powerful, incredibly cost effective. It's just common sense, but it's getting a lot of traction. I think we'll get a lot more traction. It's something we worked on a lot at the department. There's also ways to make our grid more effective, more useful. Grid enhancing technologies, reconductoring. Again, if you're not familiar with those terms, I think there's huge, huge opportunity space there. So there's a lot of technological opportunities, especially that cost reduction, that I think are incredibly exciting. Enhanced geothermal is another one, baseload power that's super, super exciting. The third trend, which is not positive, is uncertainty. We've got so much more uncertainty in our federal policy landscape right now. As any investor will tell you, as any company will tell you, as any entrepreneur will tell you, any utility will tell you, uncertainty is not good for making decisions, not good for making efficient decisions going forward. Just a couple examples of what I'm talking about in this administration, and I'm not trying to make this a political point, I'm trying to make this as an energy nerd point in terms of energy markets. This administration decided to pull a permit for offshore wind. Now, it's clear they don't like offshore wind. But they pulled a permit for offshore wind for a project that was 80% plus being completed. In what world does it make sense when everything's been constructed, it's about ready to be generating electricity, and you pull the permit and you just have a sunk investment? One example. Building transmission in our country is incredibly important, right? So that we can make sure the wind and the solar and the natural gas and all the other pieces all fit together where there is that demand. It brings efficiency in the system. It's something that I think any administration, all administrations should be pulling for. There was a big transmission line. A lot of work had been done on it. Grain Belt Express is the name of it for those who want to check it out. We actually worked with our loan program for, I think it was about a $2.3 billion loan to try to help that come to fruition. Good for, frankly, everybody on that. Even though it's under conditional commitment, even though the government has said we're going to make a deal with you, this administration, for a number of reasons we can get into if you'd like, pulled that conditional commitment. Incredibly disruptive, incredibly upsetting for private sector expectations. So there's a lot of uncertainty now. My hope is this administration becomes more pragmatic. My hope is they see that affordability is a big issue, is a big deal for consumers all across the country. We certainly felt that in the Biden administration. That is something that you either pay attention to or you get whacked in the polls, and we'll see what happens. But my hope is these guys become much more pragmatic and bring more certainty into the market, which I think is good for everybody.
Great, thanks. And we'll pick up on a lot of that, although we probably won't have time to get to everything that would be interesting to talk about. But why don't we start with this affordability point? It's certainly dominating a lot of the conversation, a lot of the headlines. It's putting energy into the news in a way that it isn't always, or electricity at least, into the news in the way that it isn't always. You see a lot of summer gas stories when it's summertime, gas price stories, but electricity is really in the focus now. And for all the reasons that you both talked about, we're seeing a big increase in demand, and electricity prices are going up. And that is creating an attention and a politics around the affordability of electricity. And so, in a recent governor's debate in New Jersey, it was a main topic of conversation. One of the candidates announced that she'd have an emergency order on her first day to try and address electricity prices. Of course, being responsive to increasing prices is critical and something that you would expect government to do, but it also can create a sort of pressure to make major changes in the system or to take actions that, that maybe try and look like you're addressing the issue, but like can create some other challenges. And one of those, at least in this region, in the sort of mid-Atlantic region, relates to the sort of the way the electricity market operates. And so, Kathleen, I thought maybe I'd start with you to ask about how the sort of politics of affordability is affecting industry, your investment strategy, and there's some calls politically and otherwise to make changes, re-regulating the electric industry, making major changes to the way the grid operates. A lot of policy integrity's work has been around how do we create efficient markets to get stuff built, over the long term quickly, but that can sometimes get disrupted by this sort of immediate crisis mentality. I'm curious if you can say a little bit about what you all are seeing and what we need to do or be careful not to do as we're responding to some of those trends.
Yeah, I think it's important that we start here because it is such a fundamental part of anybody's life, whether you're a family or a business, that you have reliable electricity at an affordable price. So I'm glad you started with that. And Dave, when you were talking about uncertainty, as soon as you said that word, I wasn't thinking about Revolution Wind, because thankfully we did have a court order letting them continue construction. It's about your question. It's about, are we going to all of a sudden, because we have an increase in demand, and that means we are going to need some more supply. We could talk about what kind of supply we need. Throw out this 30-year practice that we have in 3/4 of the country of using the competitive market to manage the electricity system. And the reason that's important is because, as I said earlier, the generators in a competitive market are paid the market price, and if they lose, they lose. In a more traditional vertically integrated market, so that's like the Southeast and parts of the West, a producer of power gets paid their cost plus a guaranteed rate of return no matter what. So if you overbuild the system, customers are carrying that cost no matter what. And so going back to your question about PJM, there is this increased focus on affordability and on what we should do about that to make sure that we can meet the demand, keep the lights on, but not have particularly residential customers be bearing the cost of that in a way that's inconsistent with good utility market design. And the calls for re-regulation, I think, are sort of from people who maybe weren't around 30 years ago when we moved to this model. The reason we moved to a competitive model was because we wanted to protect consumers from these kinds of ups and downs in the market and put that risk on shareholders instead, private companies. So getting back to what PJM, I think, is thinking about, they have a PJM being the Pennsylvania, Jersey, Maryland, the three original states of what's now a 13-state market across the whole mid-Atlantic, about 65 million customers, thinking about ways they can ensure that their markets, both a sort of moment-to-moment energy market and their capacity market, which is an annual procurement that they do of resources to make sure they'll be on the system during the delivery year in question, are bringing on resources that are needed. And it's important to focus on the fact that, electricity prices are set at on a moment-to-moment basis, and it's really a function of peaks. That's what drives the capacity price in particular. We have a lot of excess capacity over the course of the day that's sitting idle that we're not using, but we keep on the system so that when it gets super, super hot or cold, we can keep the lights on. And so it's, what Dave was saying about virtual power plants, aggregating demand from your boilers or water heaters or from big industrial customers like, retailers or other manufacturers who can shift their production so that they use less at the time of peak. That can shave that peak and thus shave the pricing impact on customers. Storage resources, if they're used in this way, can do the same thing. So things like batteries that are getting more efficient the longer we go here. Another tool that we have, which we call demand response, similar to the VPP concept, but it's just sort of one large user or a group of large users being flexible on their consumption. Those are the things that we think need to start happening on the supply side. But the other thing that's relevant is what demand are we planning for? Because, as Dave said, we have this lumpy new set of entrants coming in, wanting to build new data centers across the country. And really all it takes to sort of put your demand in the queue is you file an application with your local utility, you say, I want to build 1,000 megawatts of data centers here. And that goes into the demand forecast, which then goes into how the market goes about procuring power. And if you have that demand forecast wrong, you are going to be procuring way too much, and the cost is going to go up. So there's a lot of focus on that demand forecasting and making sure it's more realistic, and that we don't have as much entry into the system from people who aren't actually going to build, but are more speculators. So it's both on the demand side and the supply side, I think. Near term, we need to focus to make sure that we mitigate those affordability concerns. Long term, we are going to have to build more resources and that goes to that point of, can we make sure that there's enough clean resources coming to the system that are also dispatchable and that can help us as we move the fossil fleet out of the system over time.
Thanks, Kathleen. And I'd love to wonk out about exactly how PJM does the demand forecast, but maybe we'll spare everyone that issue. Dave, I wonder if you want to just jump in. We had in the Biden administration, we had a sort of energy affordability moment with the war in Ukraine and the sort of impact that had on gas prices and natural gas. And so just I'm curious to get your take on how government's responsiveness is both important, but also, how you thought about how to use some of these moments of crisis in a way that's actually productive as opposed to flailing around in a maybe unproductive way.
Yeah, flailing is bad as a general rule. I think any politician, whether you're president, governor, mayor, whether you're a secretary, if you don't keep your eye on the ball on affordability, that is just something that resonates so much with. I know if you're here, you're probably very interested in policy, and you probably pay attention to the news and what's going on a lot more than our fellow Americans do who are just going through their daily lives. But everybody pays attention to what the price at the pump is, what your electricity bill, how much you pay at grocery stores. That's obvious, but I think it's important to really recognize how much they really, 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 really care about that. That was a driving force in the election, the previous election. It was a driving force in the previous election to that. Presidential is a driving force in the previous election to that. So I think if you're in any kind of public service, in any kind of role, you need to keep your eye squarely on affordability. And sometimes ideology gets in the way of that. Sometimes arrogance gets in the way of that. But I think it's so key to focus on that. Kathleen mentioned, Avi, you know very well all the tax incentives that we put in place in the Inflation Reduction Act. That just means that we were making energy cheaper. Lots of different kinds of energy cheaper. Now, a lot of those incentives, most of those incentives were repealed or restricted in one way or another. Doesn't take a genius to figure out that that's going to put upward pressure on prices at a time, as Kathleen said, when we actually need more electrons. We need more diverse sources. We need to bring on those sources of energy because of that additional electricity demand. So I would hope that, especially as this administration goes along, that they focus on affordability. It's no surprise that the New Jersey governor's race is very much focused on affordability. And right now we are already seeing significant increases in electricity prices, not just in New Jersey, but across the country. So I think this is going to be one of the most interesting things, one of the most important things substantively from a competitiveness perspective, but also politically to see what happens at this point.
Great, so let's talk about getting more supply onto the grid. There's lots of parts of that we could talk about, but first I thought that was something we thought about too in the Biden administration. Of course, there were the tax credits, but there's also making sure that people could actually build stuff, get through the processes of building things, permitting, et cetera. But that comes with trade-offs. There's sort of the need for public participation. There's important other values around conservation, around things like that. And so, Dave, maybe starting with you, I'd love to hear just how you thought about and how sort of your assessment of how the Biden administration thought of those trade-offs, and recognizing that we need to get more, particularly clean on the grid. And then maybe both of you could talk a little bit about, there seems to be a consensus that we need to make some changes in this area about permitting, and maybe talk a little bit about what you see as the prospect of those changes at the federal level now.
Yeah, so there's no doubt to me that if you want to solve climate change and have the U.S. do its part, but if you also just want to have a competitive country, again, affordability, low prices, not just for consumers, but for industry, right? How much people pay for their power makes a big deal in terms of their overall competitiveness in the global marketplace. Because of that increased demand, because of those competitive pressures, we're going to need to build stuff in our country. We're going to need to build transmission. We're going to need to build generation. And we don't have the best track record of doing that. I remember participating in an event with the governor, New York governor, maybe a couple years ago here in New York City for a big transmission line that's coming down from Canada to bring some nice inexpensive 24/7 clean hydropower coming down from Canada. And I remember meeting with the team ahead of time. Avi, I don't know if you were in that meeting, just getting briefed on that project, and someone said, well, this is a project that's been in the works for 17 years. Like 17 years? 17 years for an obvious project of Canada's got some excess hydropower, obviously a huge demand center. It's going to end up powering, I think, 20-25% of New York City power. 17 years is just not going to cut it if we're going to be the competitive force that we need to be internationally, if we're going to provide those electrons, and to do it with clean power and clean electricity as well. So there's no doubt to me that we have to build quicker, we have to build smart, we need to build efficiently, we need to have those market signals. But what we need to do, and I'm a little bit worried about what's going on right now administratively, we need to do it the right way too. We spent a lot of time, as you know, Avi, working on permitting, making sure you have the federal staff to actually do the analysis that's necessary to make sure that you're not screwing over the environment while you're building a transmission line or other generation. That's a value that's important, not just because it's an important value, but if you do something that's going to harm a community, they're going to sue, they're going to be upset, they're going to throw roadblocks in the way. So you got to do it right. You got to front load that community involvement. You've got to make sure that they're bought in. You've got to do the hard work that's necessary to do that. I don't think there's any shortcuts because sometimes you move slower when you try to move faster and do it irresponsibly without integrity. And so I think that's why, to me, there's a need for legislation, durable bipartisan legislation. There was a bill at the tail end of last Congress called the Barrasso Mansion Permitting Bill that I think had some really good pieces to it. Unfortunately, that doesn't look like it's primed to be enacted by this particular Congress. But my hope is there is good, sound, durable, strong policy that allows us to move quicker, but to do it in the right way.
Yeah, I mean, I think you captured the trade-offs here, which are, there's important considerations on both sides. You know, in some of the states where we operate, we've seen state laws enacted in order to make sure that we can permit new wind and solar, for example, that take away authority from local jurisdictions to set restrictions on these new resources. And you know, these are two important, like, American priorities that are in direct conflict with each other. And you know, as potential lawyers, I'm sure you're fascinated by some of these discussions that are happening in the state houses, where you have to make choices like that. You want clean energy and you want community involvement, but things are getting slowed down, and we're not meeting the penetration level, you know. And when I say we, this isn't necessarily our business, but the wind and solar industry would tell you, you know, that some of these these local processes are getting in their way. But in any event, for us, I mean, I could give you one example of a project that we're working on where we are seeing, you know, we think the kind of reaction that is necessary to keep the process moving, not speaking to the Manchin-Barrasso bill in particular, but for nuclear resources, for example, we have very heavy regulation at a federal agency called the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. And there's a project we're working on in Pennsylvania. There was a reactor that we had operated called 3 Mile Island. The undamaged reactor there actually been running for decades since the accident, and 835 megawatts, zero carbon power, running beautifully. But it shut down for economic reasons in 2019. There was no federal or state clean energy support for nuclear, and the plant shut down at the time, and still it made more zero carbon energy than all the wind and all the solar in the state of Pennsylvania, but it went away, emissions went up. We announced last year that we're reopening that as a result of a contract with Microsoft, putting $1.6 billion into that site to turn it back on in 2 years to help power the PJM region and Microsoft's operations across the region. But that requires regulatory approval, and we have seen that process. There are hearings, there's a lot of oversight, but that process is moving well, and I do understand from companies that are working on developing new reactor designs. You may have heard of small modular reactors. There's a number of firms out there working on sort of the next generation of zero carbon baseload on the nuclear side, that those processes at the NRC are also moving faster than they did historically, not shortcutting any process. There's still an enormous amount of oversight on everything from design to construction to operating licenses that you need to get, but that process is moving along, recognizing the need that the country has. So, I think there's definitely a need for more, but there is, some reason to think that there is an appreciation that the country does need, new sources of power, and we need to be more pragmatic and flexible in getting it done.
Great. Let's talk about nuclear. Nuclear is sort of the one maybe not the one, but one of the few continued areas of what appear to me, at least, to be bipartisan consensus, which is interesting. That has not always been the case, but Biden administration spent a lot of time working on support for nuclear, including some programs to keep some of these existing reactors online that had been closing. A lot of focus that I know you spent time, Dave, on new reactor designs and competitiveness globally. And the new administration has continued a bunch of that. They did some executive orders that had extremely ambitious objectives about how much nuclear to build. But nuclear has been controversial, of course, over time. And I'm curious just to hear a little bit from both of you about how you see this sort of the prospects for continued bipartisan consensus on nuclear, whether there are any risks to that, including related to some of the changes happening at NRC. I think some of the changes you were talking about, Kathleen, were the result of bipartisan legislation that passed, a few years ago called the Advanced Act. But there are some even more recent changes at NRC, a lot of staff turnover, et cetera. So I know some have raised concerns about whether that will continue. DOE is actually taking a step into some of the sort of licensing work under some of these executive orders. So what are the prospects for continued bipartisan support for nuclear? Are there risks that we need to be careful about or cognizant of, that we don't lose that bipartisan support? Or should we just go full steam ahead on getting as much nuclear developed as quickly as possible with many of these new companies and new technologies, as well as keeping existing? So why don't we start with you, Kathleen?
Yeah, I would credit the two people on stage with me for driving some of that bipartisan consensus. It was not always the case that, if you go back to the Obama administration, there were lots of discussions about clean energy standards that did not include nuclear. So, that tide has shifted quite a bit because of the work the two of you did and others to include, the goal, which is emission reductions, as opposed to the technology and picking your favorite machine when you come to writing policy. So, I wouldn't say that a risk of a degradation in bipartisan support is the challenge facing new nuclear deployment. I think it's far more, these are just much different kinds of assets. You can put up a wind farm in 18 months, and you'll recover your cost of that with the federal subsidies over a shorter period. Versus the time it takes to put a new reactor into the ground and the 80-year life that it has. It's just an entirely different financing challenge that there's a lot of smart folks here in New York and other places working on. I think that's frankly more of a challenge than the political one. I think nuclear has always thought of itself as sort of everybody's second, choice. We're not the most popular technology on either side of the aisle, but we're number 2 in both, and so, we're willing to live with that.
So thanks for the kind words, Kathleen. We did spend a lot of time, as Avi certainly knows, on nuclear. And it is quite remarkable, the strength of bipartisan support. And I think that's only grown and certainly grew during our time and hopefully will continue to grow. And I really want to credit a lot of senators, politicians, and others, including on the left of the political spectrum, who I think largely because of climate change and the intense pace and scale of what we need to do on climate change to see nuclear as an option. And so when you've got that strong bipartisan support, you not only want to nurture it, you want to have that momentum going forward, and you want to actually do something in the real world and see some real fruits of that. It's not the only area where we have bipartisan support. I mentioned enhanced geothermal earlier. That is an area where I think there's strong bipartisan support across the political spectrum. For those who don't know what enhanced geothermal is, you drill deeper. So you don't just have to drill at an area where there's a hot spot like Yellowstone or things close to the surface. It's a lot of the same drilling technology with some differences that we do with all the fracking that we do in our country. So if any country in the world knows how to drill, it's our country. Let's use those workers, let's use that expertise and do 24/7 carbon-free power in enhanced geothermal. And I think there's strong bipartisan support on that. I don't know why there's not strong bipartisan support for solar. I thought we had that for solar. I thought we had it for a whole range of technologies, but hopefully we can depoliticize a lot of these incredibly important technologies going forward. I think the thing to really focus on the nuclear side, and we had some programs, some funds, some efforts to do this, loans, grants. We've got to get the cost of nuclear in a place where it can be much more widely picked up, not just in our country, but there's some real use for it internationally too. And we spend a lot of time trying to work with other countries around the world. I think the way you do that, all the nuclear experts I've ever talked to, is you can't just have onesie, twosie, new demonstration programs. That's important. It's good to test out that technology. But what you need to do is get an order book. What you need to do is have 10 nuclear reactors on order from the likes of Microsoft and others who need that energy. And if you do it at scale, then you can actually do it cheaper. And so we're in the situation right now where we're not doing it at scale, so it's not getting cheaper. So we're not doing it at scale, and it's not getting cheaper. And so there needs a way, need to find a way to navigate that. And there's several smart people working on that with a bunch of ideas to do it. The only last point I'd make is the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. This is the independent body that regulates new nuclear, regulates existing nuclear. It's played an incredibly important role so people can have confidence that when there is a nuclear reactor in their community, it's gone through the kinds of checks you would want a nuclear reactor to go through in that community. I do think they can move faster. I do think they need more staff. The staff turnover there is very disturbing because if you don't have staff, you can't do the kind of analysis that you need to with the safety. The other piece that we've heard some rumblings about is this administration wanting to get rid of the independence of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and other commissions as well. I think that would be a disaster. I think the fact that it's independent, the fact that you've got experts, the fact that it's not any political meddling, frankly, from either side of the aisle is incredibly, incredibly important. So I think, especially for the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, but some of these other commissions, the Fed, of course, you need to have that independence, and that's a debate going on right now.
Can I actually follow up on that? Ricky actually has written a pretty seminal article on.
He's over there, obviously.
Wherever Ricky is, a seminal article on agency independence, something that all the law students learn about in LRM, their first year of law school here at NYU. But Dave, you helped run a big executive branch agency that, it was easier to make decisions in some sense. Sometimes it's hard, but sometimes it's easier. You had the secretary, you had the president, you could make a decision, move forward. With some of these commissions, you got to get consensus. You got to, if we need to move faster, and the Supreme Court has really been pulling back on the sort of legal foundations of agency independence, whether we think that's right or wrong as a matter of law, that's certainly happening. I don't know. How do you think about those trade-offs in terms of if we need to move faster, what do you see as the benefits of some of this independence? Why shouldn't we just have agencies like the Department of Energy actually just do the work? We had a lot of expertise on these nuclear issues. Why couldn't we have done it?
So I think we need to be smart. right? And we need to take into account human nature and what politicians are good at, and sometimes the overreach and what can happen to compromise. I think of the Greek story of Odysseus, and when he lashed himself to the mast so that he wouldn't be tempted to whatever the following the siren's call or whatever it was back in the day. Just think about the Fed, right? The Fed, and I think the NRC and other independent agencies to varying degrees, and there should be an honest debate about the speed versus integrity, the speed versus independence. But think about the Fed. It would be in every president's interest to lower interest rates crazy low before an election. It gooses the economy, it makes mortgage payments easier, et cetera, et cetera. That might be the right answer, quote unquote, for that politician who's seeking re-election. But is that the right answer for the economy as a whole, the integrity of the economy, the stability of the economy, the certainty of the economy? I would say profoundly no. I think the fact that we have an independent Fed, the fact that we have very competent people who work on the Fed and who have that independence are incredibly, incredibly important. NRC is another example. Do we want the NRC to move quicker? Yes. So let's actually have a well-functioning NRC. Let's make sure we have the funding, make sure we have the staff. Let's make sure we have the right commissioners in place for the NRC so that they can do their job and they can do it the right way, but they can do it without political interference. The last thing the nuclear industry needs is an accident of one kind or another, including and especially with any new nuclear technology, right? That's not in anybody's interest, and that's what the NRC was set up to make sure it didn't happen, and that everyone around the country and around the world had that kind of confidence going forward. The other thing that's interesting, more practical, I was on a panel, actually another fireside chat without a fire. There's a lot of fireside chats, Ricky, without fires, which I guess is good for the carbon emissions. It was with a chairman, former chairman of the NRC. He was a Republican appointed member, and he made the point that having the NRC, I think, has 5 members, right? It's 3 of the party that the president's in control of and 2 of the other party. What that provides is a little bit more stability between administrations as well. So instead of like just one person who shifts completely when the secretary comes in, you just have a shift, but some of the same members continue. And so you get a little of that continuity, you get a little of that expertise going forward. Kathleen may be able to speak about the FERC on that account, but I think that's another feature that's, again, it's just smart.
I'm happy to hear executive branch officials talk about the virtues of administrative agencies and their independence, because this was a little bit of a thing when I was at FERC that, you know, everyone gets all the attention at the DOE. There are 100,000 employees. We had 1,200 employees at FERC.
There's actually 115,000 employees.
Yeah, right. But all the legal responsibility for regulating wholesale sales of electricity, transmission, certificating new pipelines, new hydro dams, oil, I mean, FERC had all this legal authority. We had to write all these orders, and we had this teeny tiny staff, and DOE got all the attention and credit. So anyway, we did have a 5-member commission at FERC. There is a 5-member commission at the NRC. They are split between parties. There is that continuity. The current chair is a very long time experienced regulator. So I totally agree. We need to have confidence in our regulators, and that these independent agencies have done a great job, and they continue to do a great job. And you know, the DOE can keep doing all the other great stuff that it does.
Well, there is room for partnership and making sure that we spend a lot of time with FERC, and not in a way that we were telling, you know, FERC, you need to do this or do that, because they're independent, and we respected that. Integrity is a big thing. I'm glad this is the policy integrity. But what we did do is made all sorts of our national lab experts and others available to work in partnership, because FERC staff, unfortunately, I would really like to increase the size of FERC staff because there was capacity, and if that was helpful for the FERC commissioners to have that additional capacity in ways that respected their independence, but just helped them in their thinking, I think that's perfectly appropriate.
Yep.
Great. I wasn't going to make you weigh in on the independent agency question, given you're a regulated entity, but I'm glad you did, at least that way. But so we talked about nuclear. Maybe one other resource type that certainly is more controversial right now is natural gas. So I thought maybe we'd talk a little bit about what is the role of natural gas, given the rising demand, the need to get resources online, but also the importance of decarbonization. Dave, I thought I'd start with you about about, as you thought about this question in the previous administration, and then, continuing on as we've seen even more load growth projections, what is the role of natural gas in the sort of short, medium, long term? What should we be doing about natural gas? We have a lot of that resource here in the United States, and so, what should we be doing there? And then Kathleen, maybe I thought you could talk a little bit about that as well, and in particular, you all are in the process, I believe, of acquiring another utility, Calpine, that has a large natural gas fleet, and so thought maybe you could talk about how you all, as a sort of a company that has focused on clean energy, you have diversity of resources, but you have focused on clean energy, how you've thought about that acquisition and bringing a big gas fleet into your portfolio, and what that means for the future of the electric system. So Dave, first with you.
So I'm going to give a biographical point, which makes sense. You'll see, at least hopefully it makes sense. I grew up in a small town in Illinois, and tend to view these things very pragmatically and very energy nerdy kind of thing. There's a lot of things we're trying to achieve. We're trying to achieve affordability. We talked about that. We're trying to achieve reliability. We're trying to take advantage of the assets that our country has. And we're also trying to solve climate change. And I am someone who believes we need to solve climate change. We don't just need to nibble around the margins and make some improvement here or there, and that's good enough. In the next 10 years and 20 years, maybe we'll make a little bit more, and the next 30 years we'll make a little bit more. It's frankly been disappointing, and I'll just make a bit of a side note. China announced its nationally determined contribution, what they're going to do by 2035. Incredibly disappointing. China's 30% plus of their emissions, and their goal by 2035 was just to reduce their emissions 7 to 10% in the next decade period of time. That's not even, and I'm an energy modeler, I've worked with a lot of energy modelers and others, that's not even what business as usual says they're going to do, even if they don't do more, even if they don't lean in. So incredibly disappointing on that. So again, we just need to step up and do what's actually necessary to solve climate change, not just in the US, but with countries around the world. So we have to take emissions incredibly seriously. Again, we need to talk about affordability, we need to do reliability, we need to live in the real world. In the real world, we've got a lot of natural gas in our system, as Kathleen knows, not just with Constellation and increasingly, but all across the country. It powers our homes and all sorts of businesses and is an important part of the diversified mix. So far, natural gas has also helped us reduce our emissions. A lot of those coal power plants were replaced with natural gas. Now, a lot of them were replaced by solar, and because solar is so cheap, and batteries and wind, we're seeing more and more of those renewables coming in at significant percentages all across the country. But we've reduced our emissions in the electricity sector significantly, in part because of that switching from coal to natural gas. I think the key that we need to watch going forward is what do we do to make sure that we are on a trajectory to reduce our emissions in the way we need to reduce our emissions to avoid those consequences of climate change? And so we have to take head on that natural gas has emissions. It has emissions with the methane, the natural gas supply chain in terms of leakage of methane. And of course, when you burn natural gas, you are putting more CO2 into the atmosphere. Now, there are ways to deal with that. There's carbon capture, utilization, and storage. Obviously, they're switching to more renewables, more wind, making sure we've got efficient grids. But we need to take that head on as well. I wish we could have a more technocratic, how do we achieve our objectives, what's the right mix over what right period of time. But natural gas seems to be politicized as well in our country.
Yeah, I mean, I think you gave a good overview of the reality, which I think sometimes gets lost, and the fact that most of the hours of the day we are relying on these natural gas resources to keep the lights on. And as we integrate new sources of clean energy, we're going to continue to do that for some period of time, particularly if we don't want to have more pressure on the affordability question, because of course the reason they're running is because they're cheaper, and that's just a reality of what we're facing. Even as we try to think about what are the policy tools that we want to use in addition to the ones we have already, what is the next generation of clean energy policy leadership? I hope all of you in this room are thinking about that, because it may be that as we have more and more of a pressure on the budget, that things like tax credits aren't the best solution, because it's going to constrain us in other programs that matter a lot to us, Medicaid, Medicare, for example, Social Security. So anyway, to your question about the Calpine acquisition, Calpine is not a utility. It's another power producer that does have the largest natural gas fleet. It's the way they measure these things in terms of efficiency, a very efficient fleet. They have the largest geothermal fleet in the country, as Dave was talking about earlier. They have a large storage development business as well. And once we get approval from the federal government, we will integrate them into our company as we look to integrate other types of businesses into our company. But that one in particular, we thought, is an important set of talent and assets to think about, how we go about meeting the needs of our customers. We are very East Coast centric, a Midwest centric company. Calpine's more in the South and in the West, and it just gave us a more of a national presence for us to serve the customers that we serve across this country, and also to think about developing. I mean, that was something that we have not been doing as we have been in this period of flat or declining load growth, as Dave said. But Calpine has been working on new types of investments like 2 carbon capture and storage projects that they got a DOE loan to pursue, one in Texas, one in California. They have about a dozen other assets that are suitable for what they call post-combustion, adding a capture technology onto an existing machine to reduce it down to 90-95% decarbonized, and either sequestered the carbon or use it in some other process in American industry. And so they had a team that's been working on developing that technology that was also very appealing as we thought about that transaction, that could round out our company and make us even more able to go after this ultimate goal that we all have of having a decarbonized power sector so that we can continue to decarbonize the rest of the economy.
So existing asset play, but also the sort of technology, the new technology, including geothermal and CCS, is interesting. Last question from me before we get to audience questions on that is just, so part of that has been enabled historically by investments by the Department of Energy in technology development, also solar, and storage. Some of those cost declines are largely related to investments that the federal government has made in new technology. We're seeing that in CCS, we're seeing that in geothermal. The bipartisan infrastructure in particular had something like, Dave, you'll correct me, but I think it's like $60 billion and 60 new programs at the Department of Energy for demonstration and deployment, large new grant programs. A lot of that is teetering on the edge of political, controversy. The new administration hasn't canceled that many grants at DOE yet, but there's sort of constant rumors in Washington that that's going to happen soon. The new Secretary of Energy went on TV a few days ago talking about canceling $13 billion. At other agencies, there have been a lot of terminations. How should we think about the prospect of using grant dollars and federal investment in trying to develop these new technologies so that they're available to us in the medium to longer term, with the sort of uncertainty related to the, can you count on, if you get a grant from the government, that's actually going to continue? Do we have, is this still a tool that we should be able to rely on? Are there changes that we need to make, or concerns or things that we need to be aware of if we're going to use that tool? Or do we just, we don't have the budget for it and we need to come up with other policy solutions that are not spending federal grant dollars, federal dollars on grants to advance technology? So either of you can jump in first if you want.
Yeah, maybe a broader point, and then getting to the specifics. A broader point being on how government should work, and at least how our government has worked throughout, I think, mostly throughout our country's history. I worked in Congress as well, and when you work in Congress, you always like to rub it in the face of the executive branch that Article 1 of the Constitution is about Congress, and Article 2 is about the executive branch. That's how the founders set it up. And I think it's deeply disturbing, whether it's this administration currently or other administrations, who don't take that very seriously. And by that I mean, when Congress appropriates money and tells the executive branch to do something, the executive branch needs to execute and do that. And so the thought that even though Congress passed the bipartisan infrastructure legislation, and I want to underscore bipartisan, or Congress appropriates money on an annual basis, the thought that the executive branch doesn't need to spend that money and doesn't need to actually tell them what Congress told them to do in a law, to me is just taking on the foundation of how our system of government, our separation of powers, is supposed to work. And so whether it's the $13 billion that Secretary Wright was talking about, that is money, again, that Congress told the executive branch to do something with. I remember, Avi, when we were in charge, we took that incredibly seriously. There were certain programs that I would have liked to have been done a different way, or maybe we do a little bit more, a little bit of that. But what we did is we put civil servants in charge of actually picking who got that money, so that we could have a policy process with integrity and actually follow the law. Not just the technical nature of the law, maybe you can find a court somewhere or a judge somewhere that might agree with you, but to take very importantly, when you do an oath to the Constitution, that you're going to follow the Constitution, and you're going to respect the fact that Congress is Article I. Now, Article I isn't really stepping up for their prerogatives so much these days, at least a lot of senators and representatives. They should be pushing back on any attempt by the executive branch to not spend the money that they gave, to not follow the laws that they've been written. So I think this is a big deal. I know it gets a little bit wonky for those who don't follow separation of powers or constitutional theory or other kinds of things, but I think this is a big, big deal that deserves an awful lot of attention, and a lot of folks should be concerned about it. All right, now back to the kind of energy question you really asked, Avi, but I couldn't help just make the broader government point, since there's a lot of lawyers here and a lot of people who care about these issues, rightfully so, in my opinion. I think it is not only perfectly appropriate, I think it would be irresponsible for the federal government not to try to help move along certain technologies that have the kind of attributes that we want, that have the pathway to be cheap, that have the pathway to help, and have the pathway to decarbonize, not just electricity, but all sorts of emissions across the board. You mentioned the 60 grant programs. We also had about $300 billion in our loan program pipeline. Phenomenal projects helping entrepreneurs, helping the private sector not only reduce emissions, but be more competitive in this very hyper-competitive environment that we're facing, first and foremost with China. So I think it was not only appropriate to have that kind of federal support. Now, we want to be smart about it. We don't want to waste taxpayer dollars. We want to make sure that we're doing it the right way. We want to make sure that we're not spending money that's not going to have that kind of return. But I think it's not only appropriate, I think it's the responsibility for the federal government to step up and have that kind of support. China has a strategy. China has a strategy on clean energy. China is making incredible strides on clean energy, not only domestically, but exporting that. Right now, it seems like we're just giving up. We're just giving up on the fight and just ceding those markets, not only domestically, but internationally. That doesn't seem to me to be the what makes sense near term, medium term, or longer term.
Yeah, and we also have a much different system than China, right? I mean, we have decided 100 years ago to bifurcate authority over the energy sector between the federal and the state government. So I would just add two things to what Dave said in terms of drivers of outcomes here. And the first is the role of the states, and the second is the role of corporate buyers. So the states have been incredible drivers of clean energy progress in the country. You know, at the federal level, we've gone up and down. And those of us in the business, you know, we have to survive through different types of administrations, different types of world conditions. And, you know, when subsidies for wind and solar were coming in, phasing out, coming in, the states had programs that kept the foot on the gas and brought some of these resources into the system. And so I think they'll continue to have a role in driving outcomes for technologies far beyond the ones that I just mentioned. As we move forward, the governor of New York put out a statement that she wants to see 1 gigawatt of new nuclear in the state. She appointed a state agency to be in charge of figuring out how to do that. She set a 2040 date. She's not rushing it, but she's saying, you know, I want to see this happen, and the state will put some of its heft behind that outcome. And then on the private sector, I mean, again, on a voluntary basis, large corporate buyers in the U.S. have procured gigawatts, tens and tens of gigawatts of electricity, mostly from wind and solar in the U.S., and stepped in with long-term power purchase agreements to get those projects financed. We have done a lot of that work in our company, connecting developers of wind and solar projects with buyers that couldn't take the whole output of a new wind farm or solar farm, but we'll aggregate them and make that development happen. Outside of what the federal government is doing. So I do think those three drivers of outcomes, they tend to compensate for each other over time. When one's more active, the other needs to be less so. But I think those are just some other things that I would put on the table in terms of how this sector is going to evolve.
Great. Okay, so we're going to turn to questions from the audience. Before we do that, I will read the CLE code, and that code is Manhattan. So for those of you watching at home, CLE code is Manhattan. Okay. Very awkward. All right, so questions from the audience. First, to Kathleen. You were talking about buyers, and we talked a little bit, you mentioned earlier, sort of these new clean firm technologies. A lot of the new buyers, including data centers, are particularly interested in clean firm because, while there's some controversy about exactly how much flexibility they definitely have a more flat load profile. How do you view the opportunity to address increasing demand from clean firm with different types of portfolios of technologies? So there's combined solar, PV, and storage, but then there's also, sort of newer technologies like SMRs, new long-duration storage. As you all are thinking about how to meet that sort of growing clean firm demand, what are you all looking at?
In terms of what our customers are asking us for?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think most of these companies, obviously to the point I just made, they have internal climate goals for their own consumption that they're trying to meet. So they are looking for a zero carbon megawatt hour wherever they can get it, but they're also looking for the capacity value, or the amount of time that the electricity source they're purchasing from is producing energy. And so that's to your point about their load profile. They are, in the main, looking for a resource that can produce power without carbon at the same pace that they're consuming it in their data centers. Now, for the big companies, of course, they have an enormous portfolio, and they're working on, a number of different offtake arrangements to try to meet their demand, and so that's not, a universal truth, but it is a truth, I think, that they are looking to be catalysts for this new technology. And so you've seen things like the clean transition tariff that Google did out in Nevada to incentivize advanced geothermal coming onto the system, and them taking a larger share of the cost of that onto their side of the account, as well as companies like Amazon and Google investing equity into new technology developers who are working on small modular reactor designs, and then agreeing to take some of the offtake of those machines once they come onto the grid. So, we haven't seen as many of those type of arrangements with carbon capture and storage, but I think we probably will. At the same time that they continue to do, all of the buying they're doing from, more conventional, older solar and wind technology. So, I don't think it's an exclusive focus for them, but it is definitely a focus.
Great. And this one, I think, is probably maybe better for Dave, but of course, either of you are welcome to answer, and that's related to critical minerals. Dave, we spent a lot of time thinking about that. Does the U.S. need a critical minerals mining sector to support the clean energy transition? What do we need to do to make that happen, if so?
Yeah, as you know, Avi, we did spend a lot of time on this issue, rightfully so. And I think the important part to think about with critical minerals, it's not only important where you mine those minerals, but the real challenge in terms of diversity is, and stranglehold on supply, is the processing of those minerals. Minerals are mined in a lot of different places, but China controls the vast majority of processing, in some cases 100%, in other cases 90+%. Now, China's done that for a whole number of reasons. I don't think it's healthy for any one country to have 90% of any production of something that's valuable in all sorts of important applications around the country. So we spent a lot of time not only analyzing where the mining was, where the processing was, but then what do you do about that? And so there's certain things, and a lot of the incentives that we had, the grants, the loans, we're trying to diversify not only the mining, but diversify the processing piece. And not only domestically as well, but this is a phenomenal example of how important international alliances and international partners are as well. It may be that Canada's processing, or Australia's processing, or India might be a diversification source for a lot of these clean energy minerals, these critical minerals going forward. So you've got to figure out not only what your domestic strategy is, but what's your international strategy going forward. One thing to think about, though, with the new energy technologies, the clean energy technologies, which many of them with magnets and wind and solar PV do require significant amounts, batteries, of course, significant amounts of critical minerals, is unlike fossil fuel, you don't once you have a lot of those critical minerals, those solar PV panels, those batteries in your country, you can recycle them into new products, assuming you have efficient, cost-effective recycling programs. Now, hopefully your economy continues to grow and you're going to need some source, but it's not like you need fuel coming in all the time, every day, like we need fuel. Other countries need fuel, whether it's oil or natural gas or other fossil fuels. So there's some inherent national security benefits when you are focused on some of these clean energy technologies. No one's put another way, unless there's some new technology I don't know about. I don't think someone's going to come and put a solar shield over our country and stop the sun from coming in. But you could have a country that restricts certain supplies or makes commodities that you need to buy on a regular basis more expensive. And we've seen price spikes in oil. Even though we're a net exporter of oil right now, it's a global oil market. And so we paid the price of the volatility coming after COVID, and paid the price of the volatility. By we, everybody who drives or uses gasoline, paid the price, even though we're a net exporter of oil. So that volatility is something that I think we should be thinking about, again, when we take a very nerdy analytical approach to what kinds of fuels, what kind of sources of energy that we want to be really doubling down on and thinking about going forward.
Great. Okay, how about for you, Kathleen, I think, although again, welcome to jump in. What are the low-hanging fruits that we can work on and address right now to ensure energy affordability?
Yeah, I think that goes back to where we started, is some of these virtual power plant ideas, making sure that we have the right procurement mechanisms for things like storage that can help us with hitting those peaks. And then the load forecasting point you wanted to geek out on. I think those are like the three top things that I would point to that we should be focusing on in the near term as we work on perhaps some other strategies for procuring resources longer term. I mean, I think the challenge that we've seen in the markets that we have is that they're procuring energy hour to hour and capacity year to year, and there are no longer term procurement tools. Now, states could do that on behalf of customers, do some sort of longer term capacity hedge, or the markets themselves could have a longer term product than just a 1-year capacity print. Those are going to take some time to put into place, but I think doing those sort of low-hanging fruit first, as we work on maybe some different structural market designs, that's what we should be doing.
Dave, you mentioned at the start GETS and reconductoring, and I thought maybe I'd just give you a chance to tell people what those are. Maybe those aren't tomorrow's solutions, but they're like not 5-year solutions. So what were you talking about there?
Yeah, so there's a whole suite of technologies, and frankly using AI and some data tools as well, just to get the most out of our grids, right? The grid you almost think of as like an organism. It's an incredibly complicated machine. It's incredibly important as well. The more efficient that our grid is, the more efficient that transmission is, the more efficient that distribution is, the cheaper we'll have energy, the better, the lower our carbon footprint, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a whole suite of technologies to just try to get more out of your existing assets. right? We need to build new transmission, that's no doubt about that, but if we can get even more electrons on a transmission line that's already constructed, that's what reconductoring does, that's what grid enhancing technologies do, that's a big, big win. Now, the way to get that done is to think through from a policy market design perspective. Utilities are pretty conservative. By that, I don't mean politically conservative. Many utilities know what they've done, and that's what they want to continue to do, unless there's the compelling financial incentive, unless regulators, unless others are putting incentives in place for wider adoption of some of these technologies. That's what we were working on. To me, it's a no-brainer, but it requires a lot of smart folks really diving in and making it happen.
Okay, you can't get an energy panel without getting a question about LNG exports, our favorite topic. So I'll tee this up for Dave, probably in the first instance, but there's a part of this question I think is also relevant for the broader electricity system. So how should we think about the trade-off between more U.S. production and meeting global greenhouse gas targets? What are the political trade-offs, and how does it affect domestic affordability? And I think the part of this that is sort of maybe particularly relevant for the electric power sector here in the U.S., Kathleen, is, how do you think about gas procurement and whether LNG exports are going to raise affordability issues on the production side for you all, or that's not a factor? You take the market price as it is, but how do you all think about that question? So, Dave, starting with you, though, on the general LNG.
So we spend a lot of time, as you know, Avi, on this issue. Encourage folks who really want to nerd out on this stuff. We asked some of our independent national labs to really do a detailed assessment on what does it mean if we export more and more of our natural gas through what's called LNG, liquefied natural gas, for those who don't follow this closely. There was also a more publicly accessible, just a few-page letter that Secretary Granholm put out, kind of explaining our kind of takeaways, key messages, key lessons learned from that analysis, for anybody who'd like to check that out. I think there's a few issues that really need to be thought through on this. One is, as we export more and more of our natural gas abroad, what happens is it becomes a globally traded commodity. What happens then, like we were talking about with oil and gasoline, is even if we're a net exporter, and we are a net exporter of natural gas right now, but if it becomes a globally traded commodity, what that means is our prices will be the same as prices for natural gas internationally, or at least some difference, but a lot closer. Right now, consumers all across this country, including business consumers, pay an awful lot less for natural gas. I think it's 6 times less than some countries pay for natural gas. And so as you export more and more natural gas, you're raising your prices, and you're also importing volatility instead of having a cushion against that volatility because you're not exporting as much. And so we had some detailed analysis. That's a big, big deal, and something that even if you don't care about climate change, you should take into account. The reason this is relevant is both the FERC and the Department of Energy have authorizations for companies who want to export more volumes and put in place facilities. And so there's a role. The Secretary of Energy in particular has to make a public interest determination to say if it's in the public interest to export more. That's why it's relevant for the 2 agencies to do that. And then there's the climate considerations, which are also significant. We mentioned and talked about before that natural gas has certain advantages against coal. As you combust, coal is, and there's some disagreement about this, but take a look at the numbers for yourself. Coal is roughly twice as carbon intensive when you burn it than natural gas is. That's why I was saying when we switched from coal to natural gas, we actually got some significant carbon reductions in our country. But it is a significant source of carbon dioxide emissions, to the tune that just one, and this is the biggest, natural gas liquefaction project in the queue, 4 BCF, billion cubic feet per day, for those who want the metric, is a huge amount. I asked the team to do the analysis on what does that mean if you add up all the methane emissions, all the leakage that happens throughout the throughout the fracking process, throughout the transport to get it to the liquid, to that natural gas liquefaction facility, exporting it, and then burning it. What are those total greenhouse gas emissions? And they came back with a startling number that one project, now this is the biggest project, had more emissions, gross emissions, than about 150 countries around our world. So the stakes here are pretty significant when it comes to climate change and thinking about the implications of that. What we asked the team to do, and it's very detailed, very nuanced analysis, is what are the different scenarios that we would have in the world, and what does that mean if we export more natural gas? What is it displacing? Is it displacing coal? Is it displacing solar? Is it displacing wind? And what does that mean in terms of us being on a pathway to achieve our climate objectives going forward? It's very nuanced, it's very detailed, but there are big stakes on both affordability for consumers here in the US, but big stakes for the climate too.
Do you want to say anything? You can say no if you want.
I do want to just say one thing. I want to echo what you said earlier about considering public service. I was in private practice at Skadden for 10 years. Before I went into the government, I went in under Republican administration in 2006 and stayed through the Democrat administration and left in 2010. I miss being in government every day. It was one of my favorite things I've ever done. I did not miss it when I was watching you all trying to deal with this issue. That just looked painful. But thank you for your service in managing through. I think Dave did a great job explaining the considerations and trade-offs. It's a hard issue, and I think you guys did as well as you could have.
I think you might be the first person to ever say that about the work that we did on this issue.
It was hard.
But thank you. Okay. What are the short and long-term impacts of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, or OB3, or HR1, or it's got lots of names, but this reconciliation bill that had lots of tax-related issues, but a lot of energy issues as well. There are some big changes in the tax code, although some interesting decisions to keep for a long time. Credits for some of the newer technologies, but also some major changes in the bill. How are you all thinking about the future in light of the reconciliation bill? So Kathleen, start with you, and Dave, you can jump into it.
I like OB3. It has that Star Wars flavor to it. I think there's this sentiment in the broader society that it sort of repealed the entire Inflation Reduction Act. It clearly did not do that. And I think, when Dave was saying solar is the cheapest thing to build right now, it is the cheapest thing to build, and I think we're still going to see plenty of solar, regardless of what happened with the credits. For newer technologies, as you pointed out, the credits do remain in place for things like storage or certainly geothermal, new nuclear. The credits for carbon capture actually increased in the OB3 bill versus what they were in the IRA. So, it's certainly going to have an impact, but I think, because of some of the market dynamics that we've talked about today, we're still going to see investment in new clean generation and, for some period of time, some support for new technologies too.
So we're here among friends, so I'm going to be candid, and I'm no longer working for the government, so I guess that allows me to be candid. I think OB3, or whatever you want to call it, is a disaster, and will be a disaster going forward. Give you one energy point and one broader point. On energy, while Kathleen's right, it did not repeal all of the tax incentives. It repealed an awful lot of them, and it put in place very onerous provisions that the Treasury Department, Trump's Treasury Department, gets to interpret that's going to make it very difficult in the real world to access even many of those tax incentives for clean energy that are still on the books, quote unquote. I think it also disrupted a long-standing trend in our country when the government gives tax incentives for folks and says they're going to be there for a while. People plan on that, so it injected a huge amount of uncertainty in terms of private investment at the exact time when we need more electrons on the grid. So I think it's going to have huge upward inflationary pressure. It's going to increase prices all across the country, and this administration is going to have to bear the political consequences of that. I think that's the reason they're not really talking about the bill so much. Trump has even acknowledged that maybe they need to rename it, maybe they need to do something to it. They should have thought about that before they they passed it. The other piece beyond energy that I think is really challenging, and we all need to keep our eye on the ball, we've got a real problem in our society and around the world on inequality of wealth. When you have people who are worth, I don't know what the Zuckerberg's worth these days, or Jensen Huang from NVIDIA, I think it's like $300 billion or something like that. I don't know how you spend $300 billion. Like, that's a crazy amount of money for any person to have. We should have a private market. We should have incentives for entrepreneurs. But what the OB3 does is it just exacerbates those inequalities of wealth that we've got across our country in ways that I don't think are healthy, not only for those who need health care help, who need lower energy bills the most, but I don't think it's healthy for our democracy. I don't think it's healthy for our society. So OB3 just makes a trend that was already very challenging even worse going forward in terms of inequality of wealth.
All right. Well, with that, I think that brings us to an end. We're about to go to lunch, which is just going to be over here on your left and my right. I wanted to say thank you to both of you. There's a lot of political noise in Washington right now, and Kathleen and Dave are two, I mean, you have heard it here today, like two very serious people thinking hard about hard problems. The world faces a lot of hard problems, and just waving our hands is maybe convenient, being hand-wavy, Ricky, but we actually need to solve problems. And I think both at the corporate level and in the government level, Dave and Kathleen have, in my experience, and as demonstrated here, are really serious thinkers here. And so thank you for giving us all of your wisdom and thoughts and nuance. So please join me in thanking them, and good luck.